Hello and welcome to the Byzantine Scotist. In this video, we're going to begin to look at the topics of Christology and Mariology. We're not yet going to look at Scotus himself. That will be in the next video. But in this video, I want to start to look at the patristic roots of Scotus's Christology and Mariology and how it developed. Because of course this channel isn't just the Scotist, but the Byzantine Scotist, and I have a great interest in the Eastern Fathers. And so I'm going to be looking at them very closely in this video. So Christology goes all the way back to the very beginning of the Church. The primary controversies in the earliest days of the Church were not as much soteriological as they were Christological. Now that doesn't mean that they weren't soteriological, but rather they dealt with issues of soteriology by focus on Christology. It's not till the era of the Reformation that we really start getting controversies that are specifically soteriological in nature, because for the first time now, we have a whole movement not really concerned with Christology all that much. And so we look at the Ante-Nicene Fathers. I especially want to look at St. Irenaeus, because that's really where we get the most interesting information, I think. Now, if you look at other fathers from his same time period, they're all in agreement with everything Irenaeus says here, but I think he's particularly interesting. And the two main heresies that were being combated, or really the two types of heresies, were adoptionist heresies and docetist heresies. Right? So in adoptionism, we don't just have adoptionism, we have similar ones like the Ebionites and other groups, but they all had something in common, which is that they denied that Christ was pre-existent and that he was eternally God. They thought that he was a human who, at some point, usually as baptism, was adopted as Son of God. And so really, maybe he gets some special privilege that nobody else has. But really, at the end of the day, he's just a very powerful human. And this was rejected by the Church, of course, entirely. On the other side, you have the Docetists. Many different types of Docetists. You had Gnostics, you had Marcionites, you had many different types of Gnostics. And one of the things I would focus on is passages in Scripture that make it seem like Christ's human body wasn't really his body. So, for example, they would always appeal to St. Paul, who says that Christ came in the likeness of sinful flesh. And they would say, see, Christ didn't come in sinful flesh. He came in the likeness of sinful flesh. Of course, what they're missing there is he doesn't come in sinful flesh. He just comes in the flesh. And so what the fathers needed to push back against is that Christ really came bodily, that he has to both be eternally God and a real human being with a real human flesh in order to redeem us. He has to have both aspects. Now, this became important soteriologically because, especially in St. Irenaeus, you get this concept of recapitulation. Right, so St. Paul says that through one man sin came into the world, and through one man the world was redeemed. We have the first Adam and the last Adam. And so Christ is the last Adam who undoes the sin of the first Adam by remaining faithful when Adam was unfaithful. And I actually think, as we'll develop, this is really probably the most complete soteriological theory in church history. Yes, we have more developed ones that go into more details here and there, but you'll see they're really all variations on this one theme of Christ as the perfect last Adam undoing the sin of the first Adam. And so Christ, primarily in the early fathers, they want to emphasize how he saves us from sin, death, and the demons. And the demons are very, very important for these earliest fathers. You see them cited as the cause of sin a lot more often than later on. And that isn't that later on this becomes denied, but I think they have an acute awareness in this period of the power of the demons, because they're living under a world ruled by demons still. Now, another important point in St. Irenaeus is he doesn't merely say that Christ saves us from sin, but he brings us into a full maturity. So I go into more in depth about this in my video on creation in the fall. And I was actually recently looking into some stuff in St. Irenaeus, and I was shocked to discover that St. Irenaeus uses the exact same argument I do to appeal to the fact that Adam and Eve would have eventually eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Because this is told to King Solomon that he is supposed to receive the knowledge of good and evil. He prays for it, and God grants it to him. And so eventually Adam and Eve would have matured and been able to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And for St. Irenaeus, then, Christ brings us finally into that full maturity. So Adam and Eve, even if he doesn't say this explicitly, but you can sort of reason from there then that even if the fall hadn't happened, the incarnation would have still needed to happen. Now, Irenaeus, as far as I know, doesn't make that last little step there, but we will see later fathers make that last step, and most famously Scotus makes that last step. Now, he also has a quite developed Mariology, and this is not original to him. We already are seeing some of this in St. Justin Martyr before him. Because we have that Mary is the new Eve who undoes the sin of the first Eve, just like Christ is the last Adam who undoes the sin of the first Adam. We have first Adam, first Eve, and so we have a new Eve. And there's a very important development in Irenaeus himself, though, is that he says that Mary is the cause of our salvation, the causa salutis. And so we're seeing already here this development of Mary's participation within soteriology. And this is because soteriology is intimately bound up with Christology. They're not two separate topics here, they're one topic. I guess I should nuance my claim that there wasn't any soteriological debates in the first millennium that weren't Christological in nature, because there was the Pelagian and semi-Pelagian controversies. But for the most part, it was a focus on Christological debates. And even Pelagian and semi-Pelagian issues mostly stayed in a small section of the West. And so the entire Eastern Church, which is mostly what we're going to be looking at in this video, because that's where the 7 ecumenical councils happened, were entirely focused on Christology. Now we start to shift a little bit and get some really strong dogmatic developments in the period of the ecumenical councils. And this is what all first 7 ecumenical councils are about. They're all about Christology. And as I'll show, even the 7th ecumenical council is about Christology. And so the first debate at Nicaea is over whether Christ is God, that he's consubstantial with the Father, as St. Athanasius argued, or as Arius argued. Arius is not an adoptionist. He doesn't say that Christ became God. Instead, what he says is that Christ is the first created being. He's sort of a super powerful angel. Probably say more powerful even than the angels, but really just the most powerful angel then. And so he says that you would agree that Christ is Son of God, but he has a different meaning than St. Athanasius as to the meaning of Son of God. For St. Athanasius, this refers to consubstantiality. And so St. Athanasius argues that Christ is the same essence as the Father. Now, St. Athanasius will use ousia and hypostasis as pretty much interchangeably here. He refers both of them as essence, and this will, of course, create an issue as we see later down the road. But at the time right now, hypostasis usually refers to essence. Now, St. Athanasius is not as strict on terminology as later fathers are on this. And so it's not like we're trying to get a lexicon of words here. The important thing is the distinction between essence and person, because Christ is a different person from the Father. Right? So we have 3 persons in the Trinity that are each distinct from one another, but they all share the same essence. This is the very important part for St. Athanasius. And the word he uses for person here is prosopon. Now this again will create issues later on, as we'll see. But the essential ideas we're getting here in St. Athanasius are very, very important for theological development. Now, St. Athanasius shares with Irenaeus and other early fathers this salvation through theosis, that we're being brought up from this less mature state. But the metaphysics of theosis develop a little bit through St. Athanasius. So St. Athanasius says that he became man so that we might become God. He became like us so that we might become like him. And so for St. Athanasius, the incarnation is a very metaphysical reality. It's all about Christ assuming human nature so that he can raise up human nature to be with the divine nature. And so I think it really is, in substance, the same soteriology actually as Saint Irenaeus, right? Because where do we get our human nature from? It's from the first Adam. And we had this developed, our theosis, we come to share in Christ's human nature so that we can share in his divine nature. And so this is a very important development here, that we're getting a more metaphysical explanation of this biblical example that St. Irenaeus used earlier. And so the imprecision in St. Athanasius's terminology did end up leading to some issues, where you even had people affirming the Nicene Creed, but then still essentially being Arians. And the biggest group of Arians this time are the followers of Eunomius, because Eunomius is very subtle in the arguments he makes for Arianism. And so the Cappadocian Fathers had to respond to Eunomius. And so it's especially in the first Cappadocian Father, St. Basil, that we really get the important developments in terminology. So in one of his letters, St. Basil wants to nuance the use of hypostasis, because the hypostasis is a particular substantial being. And so he thinks that that's actually not the best word to use to refer to the divine essence. This actually refers better to the divine persons, because hypostasis really translates to something like subsistence. And so he wants to say that prosopon is a mask that you wear at the theater as an actor. And so there would only be a few actors in a Greek play, so for many characters. So what they would do is they would take off a mask and put on a new mask to let you know that same actor is now playing a different character within the play. And so St. Basil wants to say, no, it's not like that. It's not that there's one person switching out three masks. That would be modalism. And that's what the Eunomians were arguing that the Cappadocians held. They argued they were Eunomians. They argued they were modalists. And so St. Basil wants to say, no, these are three distinct hypostases, but they all share in common one nature, one physis. And this is going to be really central here. They have one physis, and they have physis is the same as ousia. These two are interchangeable, so we still keep the use of ousia. And this allows the Cappadocians to draw parallels to how there's many men, but only one human nature. And if you want to see how we can avoid falling into it being identical to our human nature, just watch the earlier video I did for Scotus's solution on this in the Trinity. Now, the last of the Cappadocians not only had to respond to Eunomius and similar people like Macedonius, but he also had to respond to the new arguments of Apollonarius, because Apollonarius would affirm the Trinity, but then when it comes to the incarnation, he still says Christ took on real human flesh, but there's not really a humanity there besides just a body. It's a divine mind walking around in a human body. And so St. Gregory Nazianzen clarifies, no, Christ still has two minds. He has a divine mind and a human mind. And he shows this especially, I think, most interestingly in the theological orations, where he goes about showing that Christ did both human activities in the Gospels and divine activities. And so we can see the two activities of Christ, human and divine, show two minds, a human mind and a divine mind. We also get an important development in Mariology in St. Gregory Nazianzen. Now, he's not all that focused on Mariology, but in one of his letters, he says that Mary was pre-purified, prokatharthisa, and it will be this exact term that will become the terminology for the Immaculate Conception within the Byzantine tradition. And then when Rufinus translates this letter into Latin, he's going to use the Latin Immaculata to translate it. So this is the origin, it's not the origin of the Immaculate Conception, but it's an important terminological point to the development of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. Because of course it was always held by the Church in principle, but we're seeing the development of the terminology to explain it here. Really, the great Mariological doctor of the 4th century with St. Jerome. And St. Jerome had a big debate with Helvidius, because Helvidius claimed that the brothers of Jesus, contrary to the earlier tradition, were blood brothers of Jesus. And St. Jerome showed from the scriptures that these were cousins of Jesus, because cousin is a possible translation. And he goes and shows through the scriptures that we actually have another Mary, who seems to be the sister of the Blessed Virgin, and this, or maybe some other close relation. And this Mary is the mother of James and Jesus's other brothers, and that Adelphos has a larger semantic meaning there. And St. Jerome is a very big defender of the importance of celibacy, that celibacy is this great gift that God can give to somebody, and it's higher than the married state. And this is held by lots of fathers. St. Gregory of Nyssa writes, even though he was married, writes on this as well. But St. Jerome is really this great Marian doctor from this period. Now, going back to the ecumenical councils, we'd already discussed the first 2 ecumenical councils. At the first ecumenical council, we defined the Trinity, and the second ecumenical council reaffirmed it and made it much more clear and gave us the terminology that we now use. But that terminology still wasn't locked in for everybody. And so we're going to see in St. Cyril of Alexandria that same confusion of terminology, even if we have, of course, a very precise doctrine if you read him closely. Because St. Cyril is clear that we have one person who has 2 natures, a human nature and a divine nature. But since he's going to use the same word for both, physis, there's going to be a little bit of a confusion here, that we have one person who comes from 2 natures for St. Cyril. He doesn't usually say, I don't think he says at all, in 2 natures. He still wants to say one person from 2 natures, but he's going to use the same word for both. But he also will use other words still to clarify person. Because St. Cyril of Alexandria, his main concern is not that precision of terminology. What he's trying to do is respond to Nestorius. Now, Nestorius denies that Christ is one singular person. He says that there's a human Christ and a divine Christ, and they're simply united. And as a result, Nestorius says that Mary is only Christotokos. She's only the bearer of Christ. But St. Cyril responds and says, no, Mary is Theotokos. She is the bearer of God. Now, how is she the bearer of God? The point St. Cyril wants to make is that there's a complete unity between the humanity and divinity of Christ. Now, this exact precision of this is going to get worked out in later centuries. But we see here this very important defense of Christology. Now, we also see here the unity of Christology and Mariology. That yes, we talk about them as 2 subjects, but they're intimately connected. Having the proper Mariology is sort of a check on having the proper Christology. Because if you don't affirm that Mary is the mother of God, then you will end up affirming that there are 2 persons, a human person and a divine person. Now, it doesn't matter so much the terminology. What matters is that you recognize that there is one person here, because a person is the only one who can do something. So something doesn't happen to a nature, something happens to a person. And so if Christ is born, the Christ who is born is both human and divine. And so Mary doesn't give birth to a nature. Your mother didn't give birth to your human nature. She gave birth to you. She gave birth to a human because you are a human. So likewise, Mary gave birth to both God and man because she gave birth to Christ, who is both God and man. Now, immediately after Cyril's death, because of a little bit of imprecision in terminology from the Council of Ephesus, the Third Ecumenical Council, came about the heretic Eutychius. Now, Eutychius claimed that since Cyril says from 2 natures, it's basically like these 2 natures were put in a blender, mixed together, and formed the one Christ out of it. Now, you also end up with more moderate forms of Monophysitism, like Severus. Now, Severus will affirm that the 2 natures don't blend, but he says that ultimately there's only one nature. Even if the 2 are not blended, they're somehow united in such a way that there is only one nature of the Word incarnate. Now, Pope St. Leo, in his tome, defends that Christ has two natures. He has a human nature and a divine nature. And how do we know this? He uses the exact same argument as St. Gregory Nazianzen. We see Christ both doing human things and divine things, and we also see him do things that are exclusive. So we all agree that he's God. That's affirmed by everyone. So no one's going to argue he was given the power by God to perform miracles. Now, he performed miracles from his own power, as we all agree from other statements of Christ showing that he's God. But we also see him, for example, die. Well, God, right, is impassible. He can't die. In order for God to die, that's a human action. I use that example because that's an extreme where it's actually repugnant to the divine nature to be able to die. And so Christ must have a distinct human nature if he's able to die. And we also see at this council important developments in papal authority, because at the council it was declared that Peter has spoken through Leo. That St. Leo is saying this on the authority of St. Peter because he is a successor of St. Peter here. Now, unfortunately, the Council of Chalcedon did not solve this issue as the Fourth Ecumenical Council, even though it answered the question. I actually think quite well. I don't really think there's that many issues, really any issues at all, in the formulation in Leo's tome. But there was still a strong division within the empire between the Chalcedonians and the Monophysites. And so the most important writer from this period is Leontius of Byzantium. And then we also get the Emperor Justinian, who is canonized in the East. That's why I put Saint Justinian there, who are going to push against it. Leontius is the main writer, but it's Justinian who at the Fifth Ecumenical Council will make important clarifications to Chalcedon to show how it is entirely in line with the Council of Ephesus and shows the correct Christology. Now, Leontius explains how Christ is one person. He's one hypostasis, but has two natures, two theses. And the way we know that Christ has one person with two natures is because he is the same person, the Logos, before and after the incarnation, but takes on a human nature and a particular human nature in the incarnation. So what do I mean by this? Christ takes on, right? He is the one person eternally, right? So who is Christ? Christ is the Son of God, the Logos, the second person of the Trinity. And so he is God. How is he God? He is God because his nature is the divine nature. Natures, right, both for the Church Fathers and again for Scotus, don't exist apart from particular substances in which they are instantiated. And of course, that's a little bit different for the divine nature, but it is still true. It doesn't exist apart from the particular instances of it being instantiated. It's just how it is different because it's an infinite being, as Scotus explains. And I explained in my last video on the Trinity. But let's take again, right, that principle I laid out about universals in the last video of only moderate realism, that each nature exists only instantiated in particular persons, not as an independent Platonic form out in heaven. And so Christ is an instantiation, differently than a finite creature, but he's still an instantiation of the divine nature. Now, what happens at the incarnation? He takes on human nature, and he takes on a particular human nature, right? Because human nature is of finite beings. And so even though it's now being predicated here of an infinite being, Christ, it's still a finite nature. And so in particular persons instantiated in this finite being. And so it's not as though he takes on a universal human nature which all people share in a sense. He does in a sense, but in another sense he does not. He takes it in a singular particular instance of human nature, which we then come to share in through faith in baptism and the sacraments. And so he is he's taking on one particular human nature. And how do we see this then throughout his life? We see him do human activities and divine activities. So we know he is both human and God. but we see one particular person is both man and God. And we also see at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, finally, the dogma of Mary as perpetual virgin. Another important development during this period, it's not from these two specifically, but it's in this same time period, so I'm including it on this slide, is the declaration of Mary as Savior of the world. We see this in the Akathist hymn. So the Akathist hymn calls Mary the world's salvation, and that she saved the world from the flood of sin. And so we already see here this idea of co-redemption, which is going to become very important in the Franciscan Mariological tradition. And this is not a development that only comes in the 2nd century. This is all the way back in the Church Fathers. Now, the full working out of Leontius's Christology really comes in St. Maximus the Confessor, who finally really synthesizes everything that's come so far. And St. Maximus is responding really to two heresies, Monoenergism and Monothelitism. And these are really just the same heresy phrased slightly differently. Monoenergism and Monothelitism claimed that while Christ has two natures, since these two natures act through a singular person, he only has one will and one activity. Monothelitism is one will, and Monoenergism is one activity. But what St. Maximus does here, drawing on St. Gregory Nazianzen, who had already showed this in the theological orations, and he draws up the exact same passages from St. Gregory, he goes and shows that there's clearly a distinct divine activity and human activity. St. Gregory has a whole spot where he goes on and on. Christ did this as God, and this as a man. This as God, and this as a man. Contrasting, there's certain things that are proper to the divine nature, and certain things that are proper to the human nature. And both of these are predicated of a singular subject. And if a singular subject is doing things that are by nature proper to different things, this thing must have both those natures. And this is the only case we have of this. But we're clearly seeing here two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. In any other situation, there would either have to be two subjects, or that one of the activities is proper to the one nature of the thing. And likewise with two wills. The two wills are perfectly united in a singular subject. There's only a singular subject that wills, and a singular subject that does activities that flow forth from those wills. But they are proper to the two natures. It's a little difficult to understand. It took me really years of reading this material to really grasp what was being said. But once you grasp it, it's really quite straightforward. It's very simple. There's a subject that does things, that's the who, and there's the what are they. And if they're doing an activity, that has to be proper to their nature. The same argument is made by St. Gregory of Nyssa, where he argues we see the three persons of the Trinity having the same works. In order to have the work, in ergon in Greek, you need the same activity, energeia, which produces that work. And the energeia, who does it? It has to have a power that does it. And so if they all three persons of the Trinity have the same power, they must then have the same nature to have that same power. Now, there's also other important developments that St. Maximus has. He wants to really emphasize how Christ redeemed the whole of human nature through participation in it. So going to that concept by St. Athanasius, if he takes on the human nature and makes it divine, St. Maximus wants to really explain the metaphysics of that. Right? Christ has a human activity, but he also has divine activity that's perfectly united to his human activity. And so whenever Christ does a human activity, he's doing it as a divine person with divine activity, doing that human activity. And so it raises all those human activities up to divine activities. The entire life of Christ is redemptive, because the entire life of Christ communicates communicates divinity to that whole of humanity. Now, St. Maximus wants to go even further than this, because he points out that man is a microcosm of all of creation, as the Church Fathers say. And likewise, Christ is the Logos. And what's a Logos? A Logos is the rational principle of a thing, and everything has a Logos. So we have all these logi, the many rational principles of things, that pre-exist eternally within Christ. This is especially well laid out by St. Maximus in Ambiguum 7, where he responds to the Origenists' interpretation of the logi. And he shows them, yes, there are these logi, but they're not in things. As I explained in my last video on the Trinity, the divine ideas are not the things themselves. They are God's will to create the particular things. So for St. Maximus, he wants to distinguish between divine ideas and divine logi. Something only has a logos if God actually wills to create it. These are really more divine wills than they are divine ideas. And this is in Scotus present through the distinction between God's knowing of what possibly exists and God's knowing of what he actually wills to create. I laid that out in the video on the divine attributes in Scotism. And so when Christ takes on human nature, he's taking on this microcosm of man, a microcosm of creation, but likewise, he has all of creation's rational principles present within him. And so through his life, death, and resurrection, he communicates divinity not only to man, but to the entirety of creation and redeems the entire cosmos. And St. John of Damascus will use this as his evidence to show that iconography is perfectly fine now, because Christ redeemed wood and paint. Wood and paint are made of matter. When Christ took on human nature, he didn't only take on human nature, he took on matter, and he redeemed matter itself. Because matter fell through Adam, as St. Paul says in Romans chapter 8, because man is a microcosm of creation. And so Christ takes on the whole of creation and redeems it. And St. Maximus, working on this principle, realizes that Christ is the final cause of the universe, and not merely Christ as in the person. Right? Because if he's simply the eternal person on his own, we call him the Logos, or the Word, or the Son, any of those titles. When we use the title Christ, we're always referring to the incarnate person of both human and divine nature. The title Christ never applies to the Son before the incarnation, because he hasn't yet become Christ, the Anointed One. He becomes King in the incarnation. And so just as Christ, all things were created by him, through him, and for him, right? They're created by him. He's the efficient cause of the universe. They were created in him or through him, because he is the Logos in whom all the logi pre-exist. And so he is the exemplary cause of all of creation, as St. Bonaventure will use that word. He is the formal cause of all of creation. Not the formal cause in the sense of actually being the form, but an exemplary formal cause, that all the ideas of these forms pre-exist within him. And so this means the entire universe is ordered back to him, and his taking it up through the assumption of the divine nature, which means he is the final cause of the universe. Now, what does this mean? This means that he would have become incarnate even if there was no sin, because the incarnation is the reason that creation was made. This is exactly the same argument that Scotus will make. I had somebody on Twitter, as a Maximus scholar, argue that Scotus is, even though Scotus got this point right, his logic for it is totally different. No, it's the same, even if they might work out to it slightly differently. The essential principle that the incarnation is the final cause of the universe is the same for both. We also get in St. John of Damascus, well, it's not a new Mariological development, an important notice in Mariology of the Assumption, because the Assumption isn't written about much until really shortly before the time of St. John of Damascus, and here's the first time we get a saint talking about it. And so a lot of opponents of the Assumption will claim that this did not come about until the time of John of Damascus. It was not there for the first few centuries of Christendom. But what we can see is if we look at the early church, we have relics of pretty much every single personage in the New Testament. We have many places claiming to have relics of them. We even have icons supposedly made by St. Luke. I'm not saying all of those are authentic, But who ever claimed to have the relics of Mary? Nobody claims to have the relics of Mary, because Mary's body was assumed into heaven. There's relics of the belt of Mary, but there's no relics of the body of Mary. And I think that's a very important notice. This was not invented by St. John of Damascus. It was passed down in oral tradition. It never just it happened to never be discussed before. But now we start finally getting explicit discussions of it. We also see, interestingly, this feast of the Assumption or the Dormition universally practiced throughout apostolic Christendom. And so it must have originated before these schisms. It must have come from before the Council of Ephesus when this feast was being practiced, even if we don't have written testimony of it. Because we only have a tiny amount of what the Church Fathers wrote down. Only a tiny amount survives to our day. We have so much more material that we just have totally lost, because the only way you keep a book at this time is somebody sits around and copies it all day long. And we don't see that. They didn't copy every single book that was written then, so probably was mentioned quite a bit, and it just doesn't happen to pass down. But now we finally have a saint making clear statements in defense of the Assumption of Mary. And so, just to briefly review the Christology of the 7 ecumenical councils. The first ecumenical council is the Council of Nicaea, and that's where we get the declaration of the Trinity, that Christ is one person of the Trinity, and there's 3 persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that are 3 persons but one nature. And this terminology is importantly clarified at First Constantinople, so that nature or essence refers to what God is, the one nature. And there's 3 persons, which we either get the hypostases or person to refer to the 3 persons. In the third ecumenical council, the Council of Ephesus, we get the important clarification that Christ is one person. And this is also then where Christ is officially defined, rather Mary is officially defined as Mother of God, or the Theotokos, because she is the mother of the one person of Christ who's both human and divine. But to avoid confusion that the 2 natures are mixed, the fourth ecumenical council, the Council of Chalcedon, clarifies that Christ still has 2 natures, a human nature and a divine nature. We then get at the fifth ecumenical council, basically a defense of both Ephesus and Chalcedon and a clarification of them, that Christ is one person in 2 natures. Right, so there's still 2 natures that Christ has. They're still distinct, but it's still only one person. It just also happens to be at this time we finally get an official dogmatic statement that Mary is indeed a perpetual virgin, but everyone had agreed on this for centuries at this point. St. Jerome had already proven this. Now at the 6th ecumenical council, Third Constantinople, St. Maximus, basically, he wasn't actually at the council, he died before it, but following on his theology, we get the official definition that if Christ is one person in 2 natures, then each of those natures must have an activity and a will proper to it. So Christ has 2 activities and 2 wills. And it's important to clarify also that the human will of Christ is not a deliberative will. Christ only has a natural human will, so he still has a desire towards human things. But he doesn't have a deliberative human will, because through being God, he immediately knows what to choose. He doesn't have to stop and think about choosing one alternative over another, like we have. And this is also upheld by the scholastics. This is not a something that just comes about in St. Maximus that the West doesn't have. And then this theology, though, of St. Maximus, he is translated into Latin, but he isn't widely read in the West. Arianism brings in some of his ideas. But his ideas really get into the West through St. John of Damascus, who is, De Fide Orthodoxa, is going to get translated into Latin and be very, very influential. It's one of the most important authorities because it summarizes the entire Byzantine tradition in an easy way to find. And then finally, at the 7th Ecumenical Council, we get the Second Council of Nicaea. We finally get a discussion of something that seems at first like it's not Christology, right? It's a discussion of iconography. But we should realize that this is a deeply Christological council still, because it's making the argument that Christ redeemed the entire cosmos. He redeemed even wood and paint that they can now be used to make icons. Additionally, it's emphasizing that Christ made God visible, right? No one could see God in the Old Covenant, so no one could make images of him. There was nothing to depict. But now we can depict Christ, right? So we're depicting a particular person, Christ, who is God, and we can depict him because he has a human nature. Let me lay that out again, right? He has a human nature. That's a human nature. Anyone who has a human nature has a human body. We're not depicting his human nature. We're depicting the person of Christ. Now, what is the person of Christ? The person of Christ is human and divine. So if we can see Christ, we can see God. And so that's another reason we can make icons, these two together. And so Second Nicaea is defining very Christological ideas. And so I hope you enjoyed that video. When I initially was planning out this video, it was going to go all the way up to Scotus and then through the Scotus tradition. But I realized that's simply too much to cover in this one video. And so I wanted to lay out here the patristic roots of the Christology and Mariology of Scotus. And in the next video, we're going to continue on to the scholastics, look at some of the scholastics like St. Bonaventure, St. Thomas, and St. Anselm add to Christology, and even St. Francis himself add to Christology and Mariology. And then we're going to look at Scotus himself, and then from that, the outflowing of the Scotus tradition that comes, many of which points have been made dogma, such as the Immaculate Conception. And so I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, please be sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon for notifications, comment below, let me know what you thought. If you like this, please share it on Facebook, on Twitter, on your social media, so share it with your friends if you think they'd enjoy it. And if you'd like to support this channel, you can go on Patreon. You can give any amount of money on Patreon to help support me. For $5 a month, you can get exclusive access to interviews. I just recently did an interview with Alan Rule on claims that the Catholic Church is anti-Semitic, and we look into the history and debunk those claims. And so if you'd like to learn about that, you can, for $5, you can become a patron. I've also talked with people in the past about the use of Scotus in analytic philosophy. And I talked to a Catholic therapist about his use of Scotus. And coming up soon, hopefully, I'll have Dr. Jared Goff on to discuss the atonement in Scotus. And there's lots of great stuff coming. On that, I have started also live streaming some of these interviews. So if you are a patron, you can watch those live, or you can just watch them pre-recorded. For $10 a month, you can get early access to all of these videos. But even if you're not supporting me with any money on Patreon, just by watching the videos, by letting me know what you think, by sharing them on social media, any of those things are a huge help to this channel and really help me support being able to make these videos. And so thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.